emerged about 10 years later, around the time when Nick and I started dating, and I told him about this stuffed shrimp. And so as we were dating, we sort of went on this odyssey looking for this incredible stuffed shrimp. And he started teasing me. This is like your Moby Dick, Karen. It doesn't really exist. It's just you remember it as being something that's even better than it actually was. Has anybody been there? Anybody want to share what their Moby Dick was? I'm curious. Catherine, what was it? Baked Alaska, right? Like, yeah, you've been there. Anyway, so, years go by, and I had kind of given up on my baked stuffed shrimp. But, I wonder if you feel that way sometimes about this idea of Sabbath. It's like impossible to get your head wrapped around this idea of true Sabbath rest. How do you do that? It's crazy. And what did God really have in mind? The word Sabbath comes from a verb in Hebrew that means to stop, to cease, or to keep. But did God just want the people to stop? Or was there more to that story? Mark Buchanan, who's the author of a book I've been reading called The Rest of God, has this, it was your meditation today, I had to cut it short, so I'm going to read you the whole quote now. So he talks about Sabbath as sort of being that elusive thing you just can't get your hands on, like my shrimp. Sabbath is the stranger you've always known. It's the place of homecoming you've rarely or never visited, but which you've been missing forever. You recognize it in the moment you set your eyes on it. It's the gift that surprises you, not by its novelty, but by its familiarity. It's the song you never sang, but hearing it now, you know inside and out. Its words and melody, its harmonies, its rhythm, the way the tune quickens right before the chorus bursts. It's been asleep in you all this time, waiting for the right kiss to wake it. So, how do we awaken this Sabbath within us? Now, I don't know if you've ever read the Ten Commandments. The passage we read today is from the Ten Commandments. I've read this passage before, and usually I'm like, oh, that sounds great. Rest. Yes. And then in the next second, heck no, I am not doing that. Do you know what my life is like? It's kind of ironic that we could read this and say, oh, a day of rest. Yes, I can get behind that. And then we're like, oh no, I'm not actually doing that. To quote Alanis Morissette, some of you remember her, isn't that ironic, don't you think? We're desperate to relax. We're desperate to let go. We're desperate to rest. But when we are commanded to do so, we say no way. And that's exactly what the Israelites did. We're going to have to look at a story to try to flesh this out a little bit. And it's in Exodus 16, so I'm going to invite you to use your pew Bibles. It's on page 55. And we're going to do a little interactive portion here. So as you're turning there, I'm going to give you a little background to what's happening in the story. So this is Exodus, okay? So this is a little bit after Moses leads the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, after the series of the plagues. So it's after God parts the Red Sea and the Israelites get through the Red Sea and they leave the Egyptians behind and they're saying, whew, man, we got out of that. So they're safe from Pharaoh and they start their journey to the Promised Land, but there's one problem. Where they are is a desert, and that's a problem because food is scarce, and not only that, but they've been in slavery for a long time. It's almost like they're having an adulting moment. You know, that moment, some of you are in it right now, when you Suddenly you're making your own appointments, and you have to remember them, and you have to figure out how to cook, and you have to figure out how to provide for yourself. They talk about later on in this passage, we should have stayed in Egypt. We had like big bowls of food we used to gather around. Suddenly, this stuff is hard. They have to do it themselves. So starting in verse 16, this is what we find out. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. Okay. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Can you imagine being a leader of the Israelites in this moment? Bah! Look, guys, I just got you out of captivity, Oh. Some of you guys have been there, or you're there right now at work, and you're like, we just did this thing. Can we live in this glorious moment for a second? We gotta win, people. And they're like, ugh. And then it says in verse 4, "Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you." This is in verse 4. Merciful God. Hallelujah. God could have responded differently. And as a parent, yeah, I think I might have. God, in his mercy, despite the grumbling, we've got this sort of new rule, like the kids don't get to win if the ask is coming from a grumbling place. We're trying to stick to it because otherwise we just reward the grumbling. You've been there. Yeah. And it's hard to do. But anyway, God's more merciful than we are apparently as parents because he's delivering based on a grumbling ask. The people are to go out each day and gather enough food for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. So, God's thinking here. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. Now, why would God give them twice as much on the 6th day? So they could rest on the 7th. Right, exactly. So basically, they reacted by grumbling, and God in his mercy gave them what they needed. In the morning, he would rain down manna. In the evening, he would provide quail to eat, and so they would have 2 full meals a day. But what's amazing in all so many of these Old Testament passages, you can sort of see just the nature of humanity in them. So in verse 20, we really see their need for security, right? In verse 20, it says, "However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them." So this is what happened. On that 6th day, did they trust that the manna would come on the 7th in the morning? Oh, no, that's wrong. What happened? They didn't trust, not just on the 6th day, but they didn't trust on any day that the manna would come in the morning. They held on to it, okay? This should be, crank this around a little bit. Do you think you would have held on to the manna just in case it wasn't provided in the morning? Mm-hmm. Their desire for security was so strong, even though they were living amidst twice-a-day miracles. So you would think that would help their faith, right? Like you think, well, if God was giving me a twice-a-day miracle situation, then, maybe I would actually trust him with stuff. But nevertheless, here's what happens in verse 27, okay? "Nevertheless, some of the people," so now we're talking about the 7th day, "went out on the 7th day to gather the manna." So even though they were told to trust God for the 7th day provision, on the 6th day, they were supposed to save it on the 6th day for the 7th day. It was not going to get rotten on the 6th day into the 7th day. This was how God had worked it out. And they found nothing on that seventh day. And then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions?" Poor Moses, he gets blamed, and he probably didn't even do the sin. "Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the sixth day he gave you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the seventh day. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the seventh day. So, my question for you guys is, what can we learn from the story of manna from heaven? And what I'd like you to do, I'm going to stretch you. I'm sorry, some of you hate this. Some of you love it, which is why we'll do it sometimes, okay? I want you to turn to a neighbor, and I want you to introduce yourself, and I want you to share with them, what kind of work you do. If it's volunteering, if it's a job, if you're here with someone from your family, I'm going to ask you to talk to somebody else. And then I want you to talk about what were the Israelites to learn from receiving manna in the fashion that they did. Okay, so it was daily. They didn't get any on Sunday. They were supposed to save it on the sixth day. So is that too many instructions? Some of you said yes. You guys are so capable. So introduce yourself, say what work means for you, and then talk about why did the Israelites receive manna in this way. You have 2 minutes. Go. All right, 30 seconds. All right, let's bring it in. This is really just a break for me to fan myself. So, did anybody come up with anything? If you really hate this, you should blame Nick. He wrote it into my sermon this week. Anyway, so did you come up with any? Why did God deliver manna to them in the fashion that he did? I'll put this down. Did you not get to that question? Okay, so you have to trust in God, but God's showing his love. Okay, yeah. Anything else? Jim? To develop their faith and trust in God. All right, and why would the way that God provided for them sort of help that along? They couldn't store it up. Yeah. They had to trust every day. Sort of cruel in a way. But God delivered every single day, just like he said that he would. Yeah. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? He developed he caused the Israelites to develop a dependent provision, an understanding that they were actually dependent on God. A couple other things we've noticed is that God didn't just reward the hard worker. He rewarded he provided for the grumbler, the hard worker. And certainly we see echoes of the gospel in that sort of provision ethic, right? This table is not just for us overachiever types, is it? The table is provided for anyone who will come and say, God, I do depend on you. So we cannot hoard God's provision, right? Oh, that is just so hard. And rest, this idea of Sabbath rest, is dependent on trusting that God will provide for us whether we are taskmasters or not, whether we get straight A's, whether we climb the corporate ladder, whether we get Mom of the Year award, or whether we're the best grandparent of all of our friends and we have proof of that. Sabbath rest comes from trusting in God apart from our own performance. So this idea that God instructed the Israelites to rest for a day or to stop for a day, was that it? Were they just supposed to stop? Or was there more? There was more. There was more. And that's why, stopping is good. I said a few weeks ago, we were talking about work and how the opposite of work isn't actually vacation, although there's a place for vacation, but the opposite of work is actually worship. And this idea of Sabbath rest, or this idea of rest, isn't rest at all unless we are taking time to actually intentionally trust God with our stuff. This morning when I was praying, I try to bring this home for me before I share it with you. So my question to myself was, all right, what am I not trusting you with, God? And suddenly I was like, oh yeah, that. Because, if I stop, I'm not going to get filled up in the way God designed Sabbath to fill us up unless we practice trust. So I was thinking about how one of the things Christians do on a regular basis is we come together and we worship. So I was thinking about how elements of our worship service actually are designed to aid us in this quest for rest because we trust. I thought about the offering, how the offering reminds us to trust God with what? With our money, with our, back to the Israelites, with our security. The reading of the Word reminds us who God is like nothing else. The sermon's supposed to help you with that. The fellowship reminds us that when I'm not trusting, my brother or sister is trusting God for me. And if we can achieve those sorts of relationships in our community, we will be all the stronger for it. God doesn't want us to just stop for the sake of stopping. God wants us to stop so we can nurture our relationship with God. So we can remind ourselves that, there's plenty of things I'm grumbling about right now. I'll spare you. God loves me anyway. God's providing for me anyway. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about how Jesus relates to this idea of Sabbath, and it's complex. I have colleagues who take this on as, they're going to have a strict 24 hours of no work, and that really feeds them. It's not easy to figure out how to live this out. But this idea of rest, the only way we're going to get it is if it goes along with trust. True rest requires trust for a healthy Christian. And we've got to get around each other in order to help us do that. Back to my elusive stuffed shrimp, if you will. In June, my family celebrated my grandfather's life. He was 103 when he died. And we buried his ashes down in Bourne at the Veterans Cemetery. And afterwards, we went out for dinner, our whole family, to a local restaurant, and baked stuffed shrimp was on the menu. And it'd been years since I'd tried. I'd really given up. And I looked at Nick and I was like, do I do it? Because at this point, it's like, it's just disappointment after disappointment. And how many times can you take that? I mean, really? He's like, go for it. It was good. It was good because, the stuffing that they do in the stuffed shrimp, it wasn't just the breading stuff. It was actual crab meat, which is what I've been looking all over Boston for. Why that was so hard, I don't know. But that was important. And it was good. And it was a little sweet, but it wasn't sugar sweet. It was just that the shrimp were sweet. You guys know what I'm talking about. It was good. It was wicked good. But unlike the elusive stuffed shrimp, which can be very hard to find, but now I know where it is, so life is so much better. Sabbath is only elusive because we really don't want to trust God. So we have this opportunity. We have this opportunity in the rhythm in our lives, in this kind of 7-day rhythm, if we take advantage of it, to be invited into that rest. To come here. I hope when you come here on a Sunday, you sort of have this like, God, there's this thing I need to trust you with. God, there's this thing. And I hope, eventually you'll have people here who you can share these things with and say, this thing I can't trust God with. Help me trust God with this. And then we have a regular rhythm of once a month coming to this table where if this sort of healthy dependence on God it isn't more obvious in other spaces when we're together, it couldn't be more obvious at the table behind me. Because surely we can't provide our own salvation. We can't provide our own fullness of life in the way that Jesus calls us to live it. We can't provide our own meaning in the way that Jesus does. This is the table for all of us. This is the table for all of us who are saying, God, I know I'm having trouble trusting you, but you proved your love here. So I'm taking this step to trust you today. So later in the service, when you come forward to receive communion, I hope that you'll have a prayer of trust in your hearts. An honest one, though. An honest one about what's hard to trust and where you need to. And that's my hope. Amen.